Good morning. My name is Ronald Lee, and my Chinese name is Lee Chunhua, and I'm the descendant of Lee Duck from Numchong 49 village in Toisan, and my grandfather's married name was Lee Hung Loy, and my grandfather came to Canada in 1905 after the railroad workers, and he worked on the railroad for a few years after he finished his indentured service, and then he came to Lethbridge and he opened up a dry cleaning establishment which ran for 65 years. And he had 6 children from his second wife. He had 3 sons, 3 daughters, and the 3 sons had, I'm the first son of number 2 son, and I was born in 1950. So I was the, I guess I'd say the 3rd generations. So I was born in 1950. And at that time, I was allowed to become a Canadian citizen. And it's remarkable, my grandfather that came in 1905 was not allowed to be a citizen till 1950, after the repeal of the Exclusion Act in 1945. And that's very, very sad that a person that came to Canada, paid taxes, had no human rights. And that's what I'd like to do, is to tell our story of the Chinese that came to Canada. Not to bring up old wounds, but to tell people the true resilience of these people who only wanted to make a good life for their family. Chinese head tax began in 1885 and it went to 1923. And during that time, $23 million in taxes were taken from the Chinese people. And this paid for all the taxes in Canada, because there was no income tax in Canada, only the Chinese head tax. And people don't realize it's the Chinese head tax that paid for all the government services in Canada, and yet they were discriminated against. Why did that happen? Ask the politicians. Ask the politicians, why did you do this? This is what you have to ask. Ask the hard questions. Go back in history and analyze history for what it is. And then educate yourself, and then you'll start to understand some of the roots of racism and why it's not justified. And quite often racism is based on economic greed, and that's the true reason for racism. And color is just a way of masking over the greed of a certain privileged class of people. From 1885 to 1923 was when the Chinese head tax was instituted. My grandfather came in 1905. At that time, the head tax had escalated to $500 a head. It began in 1885 with $50. But that did not stem the flow of Chinese immigrants. So they raised it to $100, and that did not stem the flow of Chinese immigrants. So then they raised it up to $500 to enter Canada for the privilege of working. And that Chinese head tax had to be paid up front when you entered the country. My grandfather had to pay the $500 head tax. Think about that. In 1905, how much was $500? And that money was loaned to him by the Benevolent Association. And when he would have a job and he could pay it back, then he would pay back the Benevolent Association, and then he would contribute to the Benevolent Association so they could sponsor another person. And that's the concept behind the Benevolent Association. The community is more important than one individual. We all gather together to help one another. There's an old Chinese proverb. We all come together and build the boat, and when the tide comes in, we sail off together. And that is in our culture. The community is more important than the individual. Whereas in Western society, it's individualism and self-interest. So we actually have 2 opposing cultures in Canada. We have our Chinese community-oriented culture, and then we also have the mainstream Caucasian culture, which is a zero-sum game. Winners and losers and individuality. So quite often, we as Chinese Canadians have to make that bridge between the gap. What do you choose, self-interest or your community? And quite often our Chinese young youth are confused because they don't know their history. Going back to my grandfather, when he came in 1905, he had to give the $500 head tax to the sea captain on the boat that brought him over. And the sea captain had to have that money. And when the boat docked, the immigration officer came, and they would have a register of all the Chinese, and they would say, okay, where's the $500 head tax for Lee Duck? And if it wasn't there, you don't get off the boat and you're sent back to China. So when my grandfather came here, the society took him down to the Blue Funnel steamer, the Mexico Maru, where he came over, and he got a job shoveling coal in the bowels of the ship. And once he entered there, he was there for the whole duration of the trip to Vancouver. He slept next to the engine room on an iron bed, and he shoveled coal for the 6 weeks that it took to come over here. And my grandfather told me, he says, oh, my head was just booming, splitting from the sound of the pistons. And then he came to Vancouver, and he went to the Benevolent Association, and they found him a job on the railroad, greasing the engine, and they gave him a place to stay in the bachelor apartments. And he went from, at every whistle stop, he had to get out and grease the bearings of the engine, and grease every wheel, and then even clean the cow catcher. So at the end of the day, he was just one black oily rag, he said. And I remember my grandfather said, so they would have this train trip, and it would start in Vancouver, and they'd hit all the whistle stops throughout BC. It would cross over into Alberta. It would go to Edmonton, down to Calgary, down to Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, turn around and come back. And on his first run coming through to Alberta, the train stopped in Lethbridge, and he got off the train at Lethbridge, and he looked around, and there was nothing here, just a train station and a few buildings. And he said to himself, when I finish working for the railroad, I'll come back here and I'll open up a business, because there's no Chinese here, no competition. And that was one of the rules, that all the Chinese came over here. If you came over here and you had to go to another town, wherever you went, the first Chinese family that went there, that was yours. And if another Chinese family came and they saw there was a Chinese family there, they would go to another town, because there's plenty of room for all. And that's why across Alberta and Saskatchewan, you find so many little, in every small town you have a Chinese grocery store, and that's what they would do. And then once a year, they would all gather at a community hall that would, at a benevolent association, either in Calgary or Edmonton or Lethbridge, and they would all shut up shop for that 1 year, and they would come and they would celebrate either Chinese New Year or Christmas, and they would all gather and talk about what they had been doing. And with the Benevolent Association also, in Vancouver and Calgary, Edmonton, they would have a mail drop, and this is where they would all post their letters, and the letters then would be posted back to the people in China. And wherever they would move in Canada, the Chinese men would register at the mail drop, so they could send money back and forth and keep in contact with each other. So my grandfather opened up Lee Duck Drycleaners. It was there for 65 years. And I worked in those dry cleaners too. All the children would work in it, right? And we all worked in it, and it raised, six families, right? I mean, when the sisters married, and all the children were able to, many would go to universities and have jobs, but we all worked there. And it was a great family atmosphere. And how did we get along? It was because we did it as a family. But if I talked to grandfather, I'd say, you know, grandfather, you had 4 wives. How the hell did you control all 4? Right? Grandma was number 2. Grandma, the other one was number 1 back in China, and then he married 2 other ones. I know Grandma was really ticked off when she found out he had married number 3. And I found that those are great stories. And Chinese families don't like to talk about that stuff. Talk about your history. Get it out in the open. It's great stories. And I remember Grandma was number 2 wife, and he bought her. He bought her. She was bought and sold twice before he bought her. I think about 10 years ago, we had a family reunion, and we had over 100 different relatives come back from all over the world. And I counted, and there were 13 different nationalities there. But why did they come together? Because they all wanted their children to reconnect with being Lees, being Chinese. And we all had these T-shirts with the Lee symbol on our, and all the kids came there, all these different generations. And it was just like when we grew up, right? All the cousins got together, and you had the big meal, and you were all talking. And that's what we're missing quite often with the new Chinese here, right? We're kind of like a nuclear family. You just have your little family, and you don't really cooperate. And that's why it's important for us to reconnect with our Chinese heritage. That's why I come down and I advocate for the seniors in Chinatown. Their English is their second language, and they're not familiar with their rights. And so I come and I help. And like today here, I'm very impressed with this musical. This is how we're going to combat racism, to stand up for our rights as Canadians. Family is everything to Chinese, and the young Chinese got to remember that. You know, think about the sacrifices your parents have done. Even the fourth wave of Chinese, the Chinese from mainland, they've had to give up a lot to come here, to start with nothing again, right? The work isn't as hard as the railroad workers, but it's still there. And think of their sacrifice. And honor your parents, right? Honor their life force. And honor your ancestors. I talk to all you young Chinese, go back and start reading Chinese history. And you'll find it is so rich